Whitewater may seem like a normal college town at first glance, but many people are completely unaware of its dark and mysterious history involving spiritualism, witchcraft, and even murder. Even though some locals don't believe in the bizarre stories, the city fully embraces the folklore, and the town is known to many as the Second Salem. Most of Whitewater's haunted legends revolve around three of its oldest cemeteries and an old water tower that was allegedly a gathering place for witches in the 1800s. Old legends say that all four of these locations are part of what's called the Witch's Triangle due to an isosceles shape that could be seen on a map when you connect them together. One of the most allegedly haunted burial grounds in the Witch's Triangle is Hillside Cemetery, about 1 mile south of town. The cemetery is still active and the largest out of the three in the triangle, with over 10,000 people laid to rest on the grounds. The cemetery is very steep and hilly, with winding roads that meander through endless plots of old graves dating back to the 1800s. One of the oldest burials in the cemetery is the grave of Jacob Starren, an early settler who died in 1828 at the age of 42. Jacob is buried alongside his wife Harriet and their 4 sons. The secluded cemetery has a history of ghost sightings and old stories of a mysterious witch who was said to be entombed in an old crypt or buried in an unmarked grave back in the 1800s. Ghost hunters visiting the cemetery at night have reported seeing glowing orbs hovering over the gravestones and even apparitions roaming the grounds. On the north side of the cemetery, some people have reported seeing the ghost of a woman wandering the tombstones and vanishing near the grave of Morris Pratt. The identity of the mysterious woman is unknown, but some speculate it could be the ghost of Morris Pratt's wife, Mary Jane, who is buried beside him. Morris Pratt's headstone is one of the most unique graves in the cemetery due to the bizarre backstory and its unusual inscription that reads Scientific Spiritualist. The true story behind Morris Pratt's grave is fascinating and could even be connected with the paranormal activity that occurs inside the cemetery and other parts of Whitewater. Morris Pratt, along with his 3 brothers, migrated from New York to Whitewater in the 1840s and was one of the area's early settlers. He was a farmer and a land investor who later devoted his life to the religion of spiritualism after attending seances and lectures in the 1850s. The spiritualists would meet on a regular basis in groups known as circles to conduct lectures and communicate with the dead wearing seance robes like this one. Morris Pratt took his beliefs as a spiritualist very seriously and was even thrown out of churches on numerous occasions after heated arguments with those who did not share his views. In 1884, Pratt met psychic healer and spiritualist teacher Mary Chenoweth, and through the guidance of a spirit she communicated with, she convinced Morris to invest in a mining company in northern Wisconsin. The investment paid off big time because only 3 months later, the mining company struck a rich deposit of iron ore, and Morris Pratt became a very wealthy man overnight. 4 years later, in 1888, Pratt used his mining fortune to construct the most expensive building in Whitewater called the Temple of Science. The massive temple once sat on the corner of Center and Fremont Street in downtown Whitewater, but was eventually torn down in the 1960s when the building was condemned and unusable. Pratt designed the building as a school for spiritualism. The building contained 2 large auditoriums, lecture halls, a chapel, and a seance room that was painted white from top to bottom. After Pratt's death in 1902, the temple officially became the Morris Pratt Institute and operated as a school for spiritualism all the way into the 1940s before closing and reopening near Milwaukee. Many historians believe that Whitewater's dark and mysterious legends of purported witchcraft could have originated from the spiritualist movement that existed here in the 1850s. The spiritualists didn't practice witchcraft at all, but many Christians frowned upon the ideology, and Pratt's school was even nicknamed Spook's Temple by locals. Morris Pratt is buried next to his wife and siblings in the family's plot, and while the ghost of a woman has been seen near the gravesite, there have been no reported ghost sightings of Morris himself. Hillside Cemetery is loaded with history and fascinating tombstones that are close to 200 years old. Some of the names and dates on the gravestones are faded, but many are still readable and well preserved. The cemetery includes a couple mausoleums and one interesting family crypt that was built into the side of a hill. Burial records show the crypt holds the remains of Henry Van Voorhees, who died in 1890 at the age of 53, and his wife Sarah, who died in 1926 at the age of 84. The front of the vault was sealed off with a protective cover at one point, but it was later torn off by vandals or rotted away. Like many of the older cemeteries I visit, Hillside has unfortunately fallen victim to vandalism on more than one occasion. Most of the graves in the cemetery are in great condition, but in one area not far from Morris Pratt's grave, I found multiple headstones that were knocked over and broken. This was a very sad sight to see, and hopefully the cemetery can find the time and money to return the headstones to their rightful place. One of the cemetery's haunted legends involves one of the old receiving vaults that is said to hold the remains of a witch named Mary Worth, who's been seen roaming the grounds on Halloween night. One of the vaults is slightly open and marked with the word public above the door, while the other vault is completely sealed and unmarked. Different versions of the legend exist, but one version says the mysterious unmarked vault is the crypt of Mary Worth, an axe-wielding witch who allegedly cursed Whitewater when she was executed in the 1800s. Another version of the story says Mary Worth was buried in an unmarked grave or in Oak Grove Cemetery nearby. The thought of an axe-murdering witch entombed inside this creepy vault is definitely scary, but the story is really nothing more than folklore. There are also no historical records of a witch named Mary Worth living in Whitewater or proof of a witch murdering anyone, but there was in fact a terrible axe murder involving 2 farmers, which I cover later in this video. Before heavy machinery existed, these stone receiving vaults were used in the 1800s to store bodies during the winter until the ground was soft enough for digging. Receiving vaults were usually built underground or dug into the sides of hills to help keep the bodies cool during mild winters. One of the vaults is now being used as a storage shed, but the other vault was sealed off a long time ago, and whatever lies inside of it remains a mystery. Not far from the old receiving vault is an interesting monument that features several gravestones arranged in a circle with a large sundial in the center. Circles are ancient symbols that have no beginning and no end, and they're often used for burial purposes to symbolize eternity and resurrection in some cases. In funerary art, the sundial symbolizes the passage of time, and the winged hourglass that can be seen here denotes how quickly life passes by. As I filmed the graves here, I found this particular spot to be quite eerie and also very peaceful at the same time. Another grave worth noting is one that belongs to a 51-year-old man who was the victim of an infamous murder that took place in Whitewater back in 1922. Edward Shouty suffered an agonizing death after being poisoned by his wife Myrtle, who unsuccessfully tried to poison all 4 of their children 1 year later. The Shoutys owned a farm on the outskirts of Whitewater and rented out rooms to students attending the state normal school that existed before today's university was built. One of the college students who moved into the Shoutys' home was a World War I veteran named Ernst Kufel, and it wasn't long before Ernst and Myrtle began having an affair. On the night of March 18, 1922, Myrtle poisoned her husband Edward with a lethal dose of strychnine that was added to his prune juice. 1 year later, she attempted to murder all 4 of the children by giving them candy laced with poison, but luckily no one was killed in the incident. A long court trial ensued, and Myrtle and Ernst were both accused of planning a murderous plot to wipe out the family and run away together, but Kufel was later found not guilty and acquitted of all charges. Myrtle, on the other hand, was sentenced to 20 years in prison after pleading guilty to first-degree manslaughter in the death of her husband and the attempted murder of her children. The tragic case of Edward Shouty wasn't the only poison murder that took place in Whitewater. Keep watching, because the next cemetery I visit is said to be haunted by the ghost of a woman who poisoned 4 family members, and she's even buried next to the victims. Another creepy cemetery that sits high on a hill in the so-called Witches Triangle of Whitewater, Wisconsin is Calvary Cemetery. The cemetery is oddly located in the center of the university's campus, but used to be completely surrounded by farmland a long time ago. Calvary is still an active cemetery with recent burials and many fascinating gravestones throughout the grounds, including a large crucifix in the middle. The hilltop in the southwest portion of the cemetery contains some of the oldest graves, with headstones dating back to at least the 1840s. I noticed a few graves that were broken and vandalized, but most of the cemetery was in good condition and protected with a barbed wire fence. Calvary Cemetery has become a focal point for some of Whitewater's supernatural legends and lore, and a bizarre sighting that was reported over 20 years ago. Back in 2003, a group of students, including a university professor, were walking on a path near the cemetery when they witnessed a glowing object hovering in the sky over the grounds. The bizarre sighting caused quite a stir, and flyers were posted all over campus asking if anyone witnessed what was believed to be a UFO or possibly something supernatural. Not much else is known about the strange sighting or if it was ever seen again near the cemetery. There is also the disturbing story of a twisted college prank that was said to have taken place in the cemetery back in the 1970s on Halloween. In 1970, on the night of Halloween, a group of college kids allegedly snuck into the cemetery, exhumed the coffin of a girl, and then placed it on the steps of the student center where it was discovered the following morning. This event is said to have actually occurred, and some believe it was linked to anti-war protesters, but others believe it was nothing more than a sick college prank. It's unclear if the incident really happened though, because I was unable to find any newspaper articles confirming a grave robbery on the campus in 1970. Calvary Cemetery is also known for being haunted by what's believed to be the ghost of a woman who poisoned her own family to death back in the late 1800s, and what's even more disturbing is the fact that she's buried alongside the victims. In the southwest section of the cemetery is the plot for the Horan family and the grave of Nellie Horan Burns, who fatally poisoned her mother, father, and two sisters between 1882 and 1884. It all began in 1882 when Nellie's mother Judith suddenly started feeling ill and unexpectedly died a short time later after suffering in great agony, according to historical records. Doctors attributed the death to poisoning, but tragically, no investigation was ever conducted and no one suspected Nellie of any wrongdoing. Only 6 weeks later, Nellie's father Joseph was the next to go after suddenly feeling ill like his wife and suffering terrible spasms and convulsions. Still though, no one suspected Nellie and no investigation was opened after the second fatal poisoning. After the parents died, a large portion of their money was left to Nellie's younger sister Agnes, who was devastated by the loss of her parents. Only 2 months after Joseph's horrible death, Agnes mysteriously died in the same manner and the family's fortune was then passed on to Nellie. Authorities in Whitewater finally opened an investigation after the death of Agnes, but didn't consider Nellie to be a suspect in the poisoning. 2 years after the fatal poisoning of Agnes, Nellie's sister Anna began feeling ill after Nellie administered a lethal dose of strychnine. After a witness reported seeing Nellie purchasing a bottle of strychnine in a drugstore, Nellie was brought to trial, but the jury found her not guilty and she was acquitted of all charges. Many people believe Nellie was a serial killer, but unfortunately, she was never proven guilty for poisoning her family and lived to be 78 years old. The ghost of a woman has been seen wandering the cemetery near the Horan plot, but no one knows if the apparition is Nellie or someone else. There have also been reports of shadow figures and glowing orbs in the cemetery, similar to the mysterious sighting in 2003. On the east side of the cemetery is another family plot that contains the graves of 2 men who were the victims of a grisly axe murder that took place near Whitewater in 1950. In the tiny town of Lima Center, 2 brothers, John and Patrick Fanning, were reclusive farmers who lived in an old farmhouse about 10 minutes away from Whitewater. The 2 brothers lived on the farm their entire lives and earned most of their money by leasing out the land to other farmers. The Fannings had a 44-year-old nephew named Thomas Chesney who lived in a hotel in Whitewater and was in and out of jail for stealing and writing bad checks. Chesney was desperate for money and wanted to buy new clothes and a nice car to impress a married woman he was seeing at the time. He knew his 2 uncles had money, so on St. Patrick's Day of 1950, he drank himself into a stupor and took a bus to the Fannings' farm. Chesney lured Patrick out to the barn, and an argument ensued after Patrick refused to lend him the money he asked for. When Patrick turned his back to Chesney, he picked up an axe and smashed the blunt end of it into the back of his uncle's skull, killing him instantly. After killing Patrick in the barn, he lured John onto the back porch and killed him with a devastating blow to the face using the front end of the axe. Chesney stole $300 in cash from the farm and walked back to town where he bought a suit and a brand new car. 3 days later, the 2 decomposing bodies were discovered by a truck driver delivering farm supplies, and the authorities were notified. The murder scene in the barn was gruesome, with one witness reporting seeing chickens pecking at Patrick's brains. Chesney was quickly apprehended by police and sentenced to life in prison after pleading guilty to the double murder less than a week later. One of the legends of Whitewater involves an axe-wielding witch named Mary Worth, and some believe the axe-murdering part of the legend could have originated from the murder of the Fanning brothers. Either way, though, many people visit Calvary Cemetery and are completely unaware of the graves of John and Patrick and the terrible crime that took place only 10 minutes away. The third and final cemetery connected to the Witches' Triangle of Whitewater is Oak Grove Cemetery, one of the oldest and unfortunately one of the most vandalized cemeteries I've ever visited. The legends of Oak Grove Cemetery mostly revolve around witches and satanic rituals that were allegedly conducted on the grounds a long time ago. It has also been said that 7 witches and a sacrificial altar are buried on a hill in the cemetery, even though no records exist to prove any of these claims. One of the alleged Whitewater witches connected to the legend is Mary Worth, who I talked about earlier when I visited Hillside Cemetery. Mary Worth is said to be entombed or buried at Hillside Cemetery, but another version of the legend says she's actually one of the 7 witches buried in Oak Grove Cemetery. Even though I don't believe in the stories about Mary Worth or witches being buried on the grounds, the cemetery is definitely eerie and also very fascinating for the history alone. Oak Grove Cemetery contains over 800 graves from the 19th century, including the graves of soldiers from the Revolutionary War, the War of 1812, and the Civil War. The grave of Benjamin Pratt can also be found on the grounds. Benjamin was the brother of Morris Pratt, the scientific spiritualist I talked about in the beginning of the video. Many of the area's first settlers are buried in the cemetery, and it was designated a local landmark in 2018. The details and markings on many of the headstones are remarkable, and while many are still standing upright, I found more than a dozen graves that were destroyed and desecrated by mindless vandals. It seemed like no matter where I went in the cemetery, I found large headstones that had been knocked to the ground or broken into pieces. Some of the headstones were destroyed beyond repair, and almost all of them will require heavy machinery to stand them back up again. Hopefully the city will also repair the damaged fence and install lights and security cameras to help stop vandals from destroying this historic cemetery. The 3 cemeteries I've covered in this video aren't the only places in Whitewater with eerie legends and ghost stories. Another location in the Witches Triangle is the old stone water tower in Starren Park, only minutes away. This impressive structure, which is commonly referred to as the Witches Tower, was built in 1889, and it's the second oldest functioning water tower in the state of Wisconsin. The limestone tower stands at a height of 100 feet and holds 185,000 gallons of water for the city's residents. The water tower is one of the main focal points of Whitewater's legends of witchcraft and rituals, and it was allegedly a gathering place for a coven of witches in the late 1800s. Another part of the legend says the tower is haunted, and witches are buried in a circle beneath it. Many ghost hunters have done investigations at the tower and recorded strange EVPs, and some people have reported seeing ghostly figures near the entrance and iron fence. The creepy legends of the water tower are well known among locals and university students, and they even led to a break-in by a deranged man in 2008. Late one night, the city's water superintendent went to the tower to do a security check, and when he stepped inside, he noticed a dark figure crouching behind the tower's control panel. The dark figure wasn't a witch or a ghost, but instead a man who said he wanted to rid Whitewater of the evil witches. The disturbed man attacked the superintendent, nearly biting his thumb off during the altercation, but the man was subdued until law enforcement arrived. Authorities were baffled as to how the man gained access to the tower since the door was locked, but it was later revealed that the man actually climbed up the overflow pipe and kicked in an old wooden door to get inside. He was also carrying a knife and cut all of the wires inside the tower's control panel, believing this would destroy the witches. After the man was placed inside the squad car, he was reported as having no recollection of the incident minutes later. The big question is whether or not the scary stories of witches and ghosts in Whitewater, Wisconsin are real or nothing more than tales of folklore. The legends of Mary Worth and witches performing rituals at the water tower and cemetery are definitely interesting, but no historical records exist to prove these events really happened in Whitewater. I do believe in the paranormal, though, and the history of Morris Pratt and his group of spiritualists performing seances to communicate with the dead is in fact a true and fascinating story. The 3 cemeteries I covered in this video could very well be haunted and have nothing to do with the stories of witches, or maybe Morris Pratt opened a portal to the spirit world when he communicated with the dead a long time ago. What do you think about the haunted legends of Whitewater? Do you think there really was a coven of witches who performed rituals at the water tower and cemeteries? And have you ever experienced anything paranormal at any of these locations? Leave a comment below and let me know your thoughts. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to smash the like button now and subscribe to my channel to see future videos. And before you go, click on my Haunted Cemeteries playlist you see on the screen.